Hello and welcome to our low carbon conversation series.
Joining us for today's edition is Senior Designer Faith Vipond.
Hello.
And Sustainability Lead at GPE, Frank Bland.
Hi, Nick.
Let's start by talking about GPE and their Creating Sustainable Spaces brief. Obviously, we work quite a lot on the existing stock, but I know the challenge that presents itself for GPE and their diverse portfolio is wider than that.
So, yeah, Nick, you mentioned the Creating Sustainable Spaces brief. I think if we take it a step back, we have our statement of intent, which is our high-level strategy. There's 4 clear pillars that sit within that, and we're looking at decarbonisation, we're looking at health and well-being, we're looking at social impact, and wrapping around that is the climate resilience approach. The Creating Sustainable Spaces brief is essentially how we then take all of those strategic ambitions and deliver that on the ground. A lot of our buildings that we have within our portfolio are older buildings. There's heritage elements to them. There are, strategic implications to doing too much to them. There's planning requirements. There's all of that sort of stuff that is influencing our approach. So I think we recognise that we need to be consistent across the projects that we have. Again, we recognise that there will be challenges to that. I think there's a view that the supply chain is maybe not as evolved in sustainability thinking in that space, but that might actually not be the case. We need to be collaborating, we need to be having those conversations in order to understand what sort of opportunities there are, with yourselves to take that forward and really drive sustainability into all of those spaces.
That's really positive because I think there are similar aspirations across the business there. So we too work with our supply chain to try and drive this forward. And a recent example of that would be the furniture packages that we typically provide. And we have offered support and guidance about getting products registered for EPDs and subsidised the membership for furniture providers to go out and get their products environmentally product declared.
And I think from a design perspective, the carbon that we are reducing, from the research we're doing, the new products we're seeing and the values, just for example, like carpet tiles, we're using particular products that are saving 69% using recycled materials. And that's a massive driver of where we were, even not just looking at the finishes, how they're applied, using a traction back system, so we're not using adhesive. And then those carpet tiles can be reused in multiple different buildings during a lifespan. So it's how we see the spaces at the moment, and it's exciting to see where they can go, because what we're doing now is just shaping the way that we work together and collaborate for the future.
Obviously, part of what we're doing, particularly at our level, is this flexible fit out where you're kind of not caught in no man's land, but caught in a tricky situation where you're trying to dress the space and market it and make it appealing, and also future-proof it so that anybody coming in can have a little stamp on it. So careful product selection and a clear brief from yourselves, which we're lucky enough to have, helps shape that design. And I think carves out a differentiation in the marketplace.
Absolutely. And I think, again, taking it back to what we were talking about before and trying to ensure consistency from, those bigger buildings that are, again, up to Cat A, as you've already pointed out, Nick, there's the occupant or customer, I should say, has an opportunity to absolutely put their stamp on it. I think big part of what's driving us is customer expectation. And again, we're also seeing that in the market. I think Toby, our CEO, is always very clear in GP being the best, and then there's the rest. That's not just how the quality of the product, but it's absolutely about the sustainability of the product, and the ability for those products to be able to support our customers in their own sustainability ambitions. And I think taking that back as well is that there's huge opportunity there in terms of when we're thinking about the circular economy piece. There's we're taking it away because we are fitting those spaces out. We've essentially mitigated the risk of Cat A being ripped out and then put back in. There's efficiency there. And then because we're doing those spaces on a number of different projects, we can absolutely use products, materials, pre-loved furniture, etc., and put those in there and give our customers the ability to have those spaces, those sustainable spaces.
Tenants like that sort of cycle of reuse, and particularly around vintage products. So, quite a few pieces that we're doing at the moment are, say, 1960s Danish furniture. And we're working with your teams to create plaques and write stories and information and saying, I was, this piece of furniture, please treat me with care. Exactly. And people come in and go, oh, that's a bit of fun.
Yeah.
But the craftsmanship in that, that product or whatever it may be, it comes across of, actually, that's a thoughtful and considered design.
Right, yeah.
Whereas you buy a modern piece of furniture and it gives a different story and perspective on, way the office looks and feels. And, there's so many heritage buildings that you have.
Yeah.
And it's about pulling that story of, I was built in the Art Deco era. Let's pull some of those pieces in. And, it's about placing your time and your energy into finding those pieces and making it work for the client as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's not like, the thing is, that's not a new thing, is it? People love vintage and heritage and, materials with a story behind them for a long time. And often they'll be a premium product.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of one of the things, and you talk about, you take that all the way up to the building level. So at the moment we're doing a new build construction over in the city. We've carefully deconstructed it as much as we can, and we're reusing within our own GPE portfolio around 1,600 tons of the steel that's come from that building. What we're doing with that steel is repurposing it, reconditioning, repurposing. All the surveys are being put in place to then create a new building not far from the Piccadilly job that you've been talking about, to give a new build construction the same kind of embodied carbon impact of a deep refurbishment, essentially. I think going forward, new build is absolutely going to be a different proposition.
Challenge.
Different challenge, but there's huge opportunity there. And again, back to your point, Faith, around sort of that heritage, the building in Piccadilly, French Railways House, has got some great history. It's a strategic building. There's obviously a lot of local impact that it's had. So we need to take that and utilise that from a sustainability perspective. It's about taking the stone facade. It's about taking the internal elements of that building and being able to repurpose that in place to deliver a low carbon new build and a better performing office in the long run. So yeah, it's absolutely about understanding what those opportunities are. They're not always going to be the same in every space, and I think we recognise that. But without having those conversations and understanding what the supply chain can do, has got the experience of, or is wants to bring to us as a client and developer, we won't be able to move forward from a sustainability perspective.
Yeah. And our supply chain are getting, there's more and more conversations around the circular economy of furniture and reuse, reupholstering, take back, anything from, raised access floor tiles, doing these Cat A spaces. Why do you need a polished raised access brand new floor? You're just going to cover it with a material anyway when you do the Cat B. And there's more suppliers now that are looking at everything from the flooring to the ceiling of, right, where does that product go? Where can we reuse? And what does its future life look like? And it's looking at, where do those materials get reused? Where does their lifespan go? And sometimes we don't have a building for them, but it's about looking at, the wider areas, peers, and going, okay, actually, there's a university that needs them. Let's, give them that life and reuse there.
Absolutely.
I think it's about challenging each other, isn't it? Both up and down the supply chain, and making responsible decisions and having a common end objective. When you talk about historic stock, it's quite funny because I think there is a general collective opinion that we should be accentuating these features and making more of them. And I think from a design perspective, that's obviously something you'd be keen to promote, isn't it?
Definitely. These buildings can hold these beautiful materials, natural materials. Don't stop using them, but then let's look at how it can be reused in the future and how we can develop on that and what its circular economy is.
No, absolutely agree. And I think that's it. It's about thinking outside the box. It doesn't necessarily have to have the same use as it did previously. And it can, you can be flexible, you can be adaptable with it. And again, that's why we really want to, funnily enough, one of the things that my director of projects was mentioning the other day, it was about just building that trust with your project teams, the contractors, with the architects, with, structural engineers, with interior designers, and just being really clear from the outset, we're open to anything, that kind of, we recognize that there will be program, there might be cost, there might be quality, but absolutely have sustainability and circular economy in particular alongside all of those indicators so that you can make a really informed decision. And I think that that's what's really important is, again, low carbon conversations. It's about really having that conversation from the earliest point. And in fact, ideally, you're having it outside of the contractual sort of confines. It's about collaborating outside of that. It's about understanding what you're doing on other projects. It's about understanding what you're asking your supply chain, what are they bringing to you, and having those conversations outside of the confines of a project, so that you're ready. So the next time a project comes up, we've got those interventions that we can start to put in place.
I would tend to agree with that. I think by the time you get to discussing a specific project, it's almost too late. I think in order to get the most out of it, you need a relationship where you understand each other's core values and objectives, so that by the time it comes to the project, it's ingrained within you. You know what people's aspirations are. You know where you should be aiming, and making those decisions early enough within the project, within the design process, to get meaningful output from it.
And talking about careful considerations in other projects, we recently completed a show suite where it was looking at multiple different projects, and you required a show suite to be built. It was about 3,000 square feet, and we managed to reuse 100% of those furniture pieces, and and that was only to do with our partnership and how we work together. It's like, okay, what can we reuse from which projects? We come together and we made it work, and off the back of that, the project was solved and it has moved on to another life. And that is an important part of how we both collaborate together, and how we can reuse in the market.
I think some of the challenges with particularly the existing stock are weighing up the cost versus benefit and the opportunity which presents itself. Furniture is a classic example where it's a really good news story, but it's almost a consistent challenge that you face each time.
Yes.
So, for instance, when we look at, say, the services and the intelligence stuff, and I want to come on to discuss how technology, particularly with GPU, features in that, but in the existing stock, you need to look at expected lifetime, time left before the equipment becomes redundant versus the cost, financial and environmental cost of replacing it, and then reach informed decisions based on past experiences. Obviously, with the newer stuff that we put in, it's very led by technology. I know GPE as an organisation, particularly proud of their Smart Spaces app.
We recognise that there's, sustainability is not just about, the environmental side of sustainability. It's about the social impact side of it. It's about the health and well-being side of it. And Smart Spaces, being able to operate these spaces how they're meant to be operated, is absolutely integral to sustainability. We are very focused on the technology. We're looking at Wired Score, Smart Score, all of that sort of stuff. And again, that sits within the standard brief that's set out by GPE, but also we talk about performance gap all the time in the built environment. An EPC or an as-built expectation of how a space is meant to perform is completely different to how it actually performs. So something for us is, and again, this is sort of ingrained within the brief, is that when we build these buildings, when we hand them, the handover and the training, the commissioning, all of that sort of stuff is absolutely integral to us then taking that forward to operate it. A lot of the spaces that we build, we're going to operate, and we're going to operate for a long time. Linking it back to that customer piece again, we need to be making sure that these spaces operate effectively for our customers, because that's the product. So having the metering, having the technology, having the sensors is absolutely part of, is a piece of the puzzle for us to be able to deliver those low carbon spaces.
Yeah, I think it's about operating without compromise. So sustainability and the low carbon is fantastic as long as it doesn't come at the cost of a practical use of a space. So it's about recognizing where requirements are at specific times. And it's about achieving this without compromise. Otherwise, I don't believe it's fully integratable. You guys don't want to be standing, out on a pedestal as the most sustainable but unuser-friendly company out there, are you? Because that's not going to help you fill your buildings.
Exactly. We don't want that. We don't want void space. That's not what it's about. And it's about having, as you say, Nick, it's about having usable buildings, but those that are, market leading in terms of their sustainability credentials. And, again, we recognise that, we've got a very varied customer base. We've got some retail customers that, it's quite clear in when they want to be operating. We've got office, but flexible office. So again, that occupancy piece is vital in understanding when these, when things need to change. But then we've also got, people that want to be working, all hours, and it's about understanding, it's about having that customer conversation. It's about understanding their needs. It's about working across the value chain to be able to say, okay, we've put this in place and this is how we want to help you sort of operate going forward. It has to be everybody around the table in order to achieve, what we want to, ultimately achieve. Internally at GPE, I think that's a recognition that sustainability doesn't just sit with the sustainability team.
Yeah.
It sits across all of the functions that we've got, whether it's our customer experience managers who are sort of face-to-face with the customer all the time. It's the project managers and development managers. It's our leasing team. It's our finance team, recognising that, So I think that's a recognition internally. And don't get me wrong, as with the built environment in general, there's always work to be done. I think what it does do is brings everybody up to the same level, hopefully. I think there are businesses, there are areas that do need that push. From a compliance perspective, but then there's others that are just driving that because they recognise that it's the right thing to do. They recognise that it's a marketable opportunity, or it's a profitable opportunity, which hopefully takes the whole industry forward. So,
have you noticed any obvious glaring gaps or opportunities within existing legislation where you think there are easy wins?
We've been quite vocal in. The need for a change to EPC legislation, or MEES, minimum energy efficiency standards legislation, and actually having an understanding of what's being used in place in performance, a performance benchmark rather than a design or built benchmark, which is the EPC currently. So we have been champions of NABERS.
Yeah.
So the energy efficiency rating that's come over from Australia, funnily enough, and to Aldermanbury Square is one of our key projects, and that's a pilot project for NABERS, and recognising what we need to do with those spaces again, to be able to understand how they are performing. Again, back to your point, Nick, about sort of smart spaces, and energy efficiency being a huge part of that. So I think there's absolutely a part to play from a legislative perspective on that. Whether that happens or not is a different matter.
NABERS is obviously, and I don't want to reference Harold Bishop, but NABERS is obviously a relatively new benchmark, if you like, which I have limited exposure to. But are there any lessons I know it involves monitoring a project for 12 months and efficiencies. Are there any unexpected findings, or is there anything you've gained from it that you wouldn't expect, or perhaps has it proved something that you thought already existed?
Yeah, there's absolutely that. I think there's the metering point is, and that's what, and NABERS has driven that quite heavily, but we've recognised that already because of the nature of GPE and having those operational buildings. We can absolutely take the lessons learned from operating those buildings and then putting that into our new build spaces.
That's filtered down to us, the metering strategy. So that's perhaps a lesson that you've learned at a higher level. Absolutely. That then you can roll out across the asset portfolio.
Absolutely, and it's not just. And we're trying to do that. We have our own decarbonisation fund. So what we do is essentially we place a tax on our Scope 1 and Scope 2, so our gas and electricity use in the portfolio, £95 per tonne, essentially, of carbon. We also do that on the embodied carbon of the developments. We take that forward and put that into a decarbonisation fund to either deliver energy efficiency within the portfolio, or perhaps look at innovation and best practice in the developments. And again, as you said, the metering strategy has been a huge part of that. We've tried to roll out better understanding of where energy is being used, essentially. You know, it's about splitting up the systems. It's about, okay, unless we know where it's being used, we can't make any amendments, we can't make any changes. You know, we might have the most efficient equipment in there, but until we know how it's being used, you know, we can't do anything.
And I think some of the opportunities that present us with our supply chain is identifying the correct horses for courses, and acknowledging where somebody has a particular skill to offer in help shaping that design journey. And I wondered whether those decisions and parameters come into consideration when you're selecting contractors for projects.
Massively, yeah, massively. I think again, I sort of touched on it before, how sustainability is not just a sustainability team at GPE. It's not just the individual teams at GPE. It's absolutely about our value chain and about understanding the skill sets that they've got. Again, you know, we've worked with people on steel reuse projects. They've got experience there. We're working with people on understanding the ability for circular economy in fit outs. But it's also about us being really collaborative and having that relationship with, you know, the likes of yourselves to understand what what you're seeing out there, what you're seeing from your supply chain. And again, you know, recognizing what, you know, innovation is there, you know, where things are being trialed. Can we start to look at that as something that we want to implement at GPE? So it's about having, you know, learning from yourselves as much as it is about saying, okay, we want to deliver this, but how do we do it? And learning from you. So
that's quite nicely put, because when it comes to selecting contractors for us, I think that we need to have as a collective the confidence to be able to lean on people's specialities. You know, we're a main contractor, and guys that build out their own packages have a far vaster knowledge of products and different ways of doing stuff, innovations that they may have picked up from other contractors that we can learn on. And it's about a collective industry responsibility than an individual contractor doing one thing better than the other.
And I think it's important that, you know, we are client facing as such with these buildings, but actually our supply chain doesn't see what we see day to day. And it's really important that we educate our supply chain, and we often have seminars to say, this is what we're seeing in the market. How can you support us to support yourselves as our client to work together to achieve our joint goals? Because otherwise, you know, there needs to be a communication and conversation around that of how we work together, because our supply chains are not understanding or always seeing what the importance is and how they can support us. And, you know, we need to work together better to do that, because at the moment, you know, our supply chain is struggling to keep up with the pressures and also the pace of which the industry is going in, and it is changing, and the amount of reuse going in. And people are saying, you know, the cost of storage, reuse, how you reuse, you know, most of these supply chain, you know, particularly like lighting, they're saying, you know, we want to purchase new, and it's like, how do you, you know, refurbish the lighting, for example, or reuse the ceiling tiles, or, you know, raised access floor tiles, and people don't have that infrastructure in place of how do you reuse it.
You're absolutely right. It's about having that transparency. The further down the supply chain you go, it's unlikely that they'll understand what GPE's, you know, objectives are. But if we can be clear, transparent, step those objectives down, and Nick, on your point about sort of aligned values, you know, that's something that we absolutely look at when we're looking for partners. And GPE is all about having that long-term relationships, being very clear about what we want to try and achieve going forward, not just sustainability-wise, but, you know, in general. And then we need to be able to provide that resource, the upskilling that, you know, that you mentioned before, to our supply chain, to be able to bring everybody, you know, around the table. And it needs to be a shared goal, you know. Again, you know, we can deliver it on a project, which is great. But again, as you said before, Nick, sometimes when you get to the project, it's a little too late. So it's about having those wider conversations, and something that we're absolutely looking at. And we've got some plans next year to really kickstart some supply chain engagement around our net zero ambitions, and what we can do to support. You know, not just our tier ones, but how do we step that down going forward?
I think that's something that we found through producing our Carbonica reports, sometimes for GPE, sometimes for the direct for the end user. But as part of that, there are embodied carbon data input, which you require, obviously we require subcontractor input from. And until you go down that path and educate them as to why you're looking to capture that data, they don't really have an understanding. It's all out there that they have. It's just about bringing that to the fore, to build back better, to be best in class, to keep driving the message forward. Okay, so Frank, as we bring this to a close then, I suppose looking for a succinct summary, which is always great putting people on the spot and something I enjoy lots. What is the one thing you would change that you think would have the single biggest impact on the industry in driving carbon consumption down?
Oof, tough one. For me, and I think we've sort of talked about it all the way through, I just love to have some consistency just across the board. So consistency in terms of what's the ask. You know, there's so many different certifications, there's so many different client briefs, all this sort of stuff. Let's just have it consistent and let's help our supply chain out. You know, we talked about upskilling, and let's just have a really clear, consistent message. I think consistency of reporting, and a big thing for us at GP is being held to account. We want to make sure that everybody's reporting this in the same way. You know, what does good performance look like? Everybody needs to be on the same level playing field in order for us to really understand how far we're moving down this path. And then finally, I just say consistency of action. You know, again, Nick, you've asked about sort of the legislative piece. There are some people that are going above and beyond. They have the resource and the ability to do that, and that's absolutely right that they do. But there are still some sort of laggards, particularly in the built environment, that we need to bring forward with us. So that consistency of action, I think, is paramount in order for us to be able to deliver sort of low carbon spaces.
A huge thank you for joining our low carbon conversations, Frank. It's been really insightful, and I think talking about how our businesses integrate with each other and the collective opportunities and responsibilities that are presented makes you feel like you're working with the right people.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to us today. If this has piqued your interest about the Low Carbon Office, please take the time to go to YouTube or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from, to find out more.